There are stories that historians prefer not to discuss. Stories so meticulously erased from records that their absence becomes more revealing than any document could be. In the spring of 1856, the plantation registries of Greene County, Alabama, recorded something unusual. 23 enslaved people vanished without a trace on the same night. No signs of struggle, no blood. No torn clothing caught on fences. Just empty quarters and cold hearths at dawn. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was that all 23 had been dead for years. At least, according to the official records. Their names had been crossed out, death certificates signed, burials documented in the plantation ledger with dates, causes, and precise locations in the cemetery beyond the cotton fields. And yet, on that April night, these dead people walked away, together, led by a man who had already escaped twice before. A man who had died twice before. A man whose name appears and disappears from documents like a ghost that couldn't decide whether to haunt the living or join the dead. His name was Marcus. And this is the story of how one man learned that sometimes the only way to save your family is to become the very thing your enemies fear most. A rumor, a shadow, a story whispered in the dark that no one can prove but everyone believes. What you're about to hear may sound impossible, but everything can be verified. The documents exist, the locations are real, the timeline matches, and that's what makes it so deeply unsettling. Because if this story is true, it means that for nearly 2 years, a dead man walked freely through the heart of the Confederacy, planning the most elaborate escape in American history. And if it's not true, it means that 23 people conspired to fake their own death so convincingly that even their masters believed it. Either way, someone was haunting Greene County, Alabama. The question is, were they dead or just desperate enough to pretend? Parte 1. O Mundo Antes de Queda. Greene County, Alabama, in the 1850s was a place where cotton was king and human beings were currency. The county sat in the heart of the Black Belt, named not for its population but for its rich, dark soil that could grow cotton so thick and tall that enslaved workers would disappear completely between the rows, visible only by the white bolls moving as they picked. The soil was so dark it looked almost black when wet, staining hands and feet, seeping into every crack and crevice. Old-timers said the land had been sacred once, before white settlers arrived. Creek and Choctaw people had lived here for thousands of years, burying their dead in mounds that still rose from the fields like ancient warnings. Some plantation owners built their homes on these mounds, claiming the elevated ground. Others avoided them, superstitious about disturbing whatever rested beneath. The Henderson plantation sprawled across 2,400 acres of this fertile land, positioned along the winding banks of the Warrior River. It was neither the largest nor the cruelest operation in the county, which somehow made it more insidious. There were plantations where the brutality was so extreme that enslaved people had nothing to lose by attempting escape. Henderson's neighbor to the south, a man named Josiah Crawford, was known for his viciousness. His enslaved workers bore scars like road maps, and the cemetery on his property was 3 times the size it should have been for a plantation his size. But Henderson ran his property with calculated efficiency. He provided adequate food, not generous, but enough to keep workers strong. Minimal medical care when absolutely necessary. He allowed families to stay together, permitted religious gatherings on Sundays, and rarely used the whip unless he deemed it unavoidable. Not out of kindness, but economics. Healthy workers produced more. Stable families ran away less. Hopeless people worked harder than angry ones. James Henderson had inherited the plantation from his father in 1843, along with 62 enslaved people and a philosophy that treated human bondage as a business venture rather than a moral question. He kept meticulous records, noting the value of each person, their skills, their health, their family connections. In his ledger, people were listed alongside livestock and equipment, their worth calculated with the same dispassionate precision he applied to calculating bales of cotton. The plantation itself was impressive in the way that monuments to cruelty often are. The main house stood 3 stories tall, white-painted with columns that caught the morning sun and made the building glow like something holy. Behind it, the overseer's house, the smokehouse, the barns and the gin house arranged themselves in careful hierarchy. And beyond those, set back a respectful distance where the smell wouldn't offend, were the quarters. 20 small cabins arranged in 2 rows, each measuring roughly 12 feet by 14 feet. 7 people lived in some of them. The walls were thin, the floors were dirt, and in winter the wind came through gaps in the wood like knives. But they were homes, such as could exist in captivity. People made them into something more than the structures deserved, planting flowers near doorways, hanging curtains made from flour sacks, telling stories at night that transformed bare walls into castles and kingdoms and places where freedom was more than a dream. Marcus had been born on Henderson property in 1829, the son of a woman named Ruth, who worked in the main house, and a father he never knew. The plantation records listed him simply as boy, property of J. Henderson, born March, strong constitution, value $400. Ruth never spoke about Marcus's father, not when Marcus was young and asked with innocent curiosity, not when he grew older and asked with understanding. The silence wasn't protective, it was survival. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, especially when those truths involved white men and enslaved women and the particular horror of coerced intimacy that no law recognized as violence. Marcus grew up in the main house, where Ruth worked as a domestic servant. For the first 7 years of his life, he experienced slavery in its most insidious form. Close proximity to comfort he could never claim. He watched Henderson's children eat food that Ruth prepared, but Marcus couldn't touch. He saw them learn to read from books that sat on shelves Marcus dusted but couldn't open. He observed the casual ease with which they moved through the world, never considering that the people who served them might be fully human, with interior lives as rich and complex as their own. By 1855, that value listed in Henderson's ledger had increased to $1,800. Marcus was 26 years old, 6 feet tall, with the kind of build that came from a lifetime of physical labor. His hands were scarred from cotton thorns and rough work, but his eyes carried something that Henderson had noted in his private journal with growing unease. Smart beyond what's useful, watches everything, says little, must watch this one. Marcus had learned to read from Henderson's daughter, Caroline, when he was 9 years old. She was 7 and had recently learned herself, and in that brief window before she understood the social order that would define her life, she'd taught Marcus his letters, using a primer behind the horse barn. They met 3 times a week for 3 months, Caroline delighted to have a pupil, Marcus drinking in knowledge like a man dying of thirst. The lessons ended abruptly when Henderson discovered them one afternoon in July. He didn't beat Marcus, the boy was too valuable, and Henderson prided himself on managing assets efficiently. But he did something worse. He sold Marcus's cousin, a girl named Patience who worked in the kitchen, to a plantation in Mississippi known for its brutality. Not because Patience had done anything wrong, but to teach Marcus that knowledge had costs, and those costs would be paid by people he loved. Marcus never forgot that lesson, but not in the way Henderson intended. By the time he'd memorized enough to continue on his own, stealing moments with discarded newspapers, studying signs on wagon sides, reading labels on shipping crates when he worked at the loading docks, he became literate in secret, and that literacy would later prove crucial in ways Henderson could never have anticipated. At 19, Marcus married Esther in a ceremony that had no legal standing, but meant everything nonetheless. She was 17, born on a neighboring plantation, and purchased by Henderson specifically because Marcus had requested it. Henderson saw it as good management. A married worker was a stable worker. He charged Marcus $20 for the privilege, money Marcus had saved over 2 years from selling rabbits he'd trapped on Sundays, his one day of partial rest. The wedding took place on a Saturday evening in June, officiated by an elderly enslaved man named Daniel, who'd been a preacher before his capture in Africa decades earlier. Daniel couldn't read, but he'd memorized vast passages of the Bible from hearing them read aloud, and he spoke them with authority that made them sound new. Nearly 50 people attended, all enslaved workers from Henderson's plantation and neighboring properties. They sang hymns that blended African rhythms with Christian words, creating something entirely new that belonged to neither continent, but to the liminal space of survival. Esther wore a dress that Ruth had spent 6 months sewing, working by candlelight after her duties were finished. It was made from cotton. What else could it be made from in that place and time? But Ruth had dyed it deep indigo using plants she'd gathered and techniques she'd learned from her own mother. In the evening light, it looked almost purple, almost royal. For a few hours, Esther was the most beautiful woman in Alabama, and the fact that she had no legal right to her own body, no protection under law, no future she could call her own, seemed almost bearable. Samuel was born 10 months later, in April of 1852. Marcus held his son for the first time just after dawn. The baby, small and perfect and already owned by another man. Esther was exhausted, attended by Ruth and 2 other women who'd helped with the delivery. In that moment, Marcus made a promise that would shape everything that followed. He whispered it into Samuel's ear, too quiet for anyone else to hear. "You won't die here, I swear it." Mary arrived 2 years later, in 1854. By then, Marcus had been working in the fields for years, assigned to the cotton harvest crews when he turned 15 and his value as a houseworker diminished. He picked cotton from dawn until dark, his fingers bleeding by the end of each day, his back aching from the bent posture the work required. A good picker could harvest 200 pounds a day. Marcus could do 300, and he hated himself for it, hated that his body was so efficient at the labor that enriched the man who owned him. But he picked that cotton with singular focus because every pound beyond his quota earned a few pennies, and those pennies accumulated into dollars, and those dollars represented possibility. Marcus lived in a cabin with his mother Ruth, his wife Esther, their 2 children Samuel and Mary, his younger sister Ada, and Ada's husband Thomas. 7 people in a space designed for 4. They slept in shifts during the hottest months, some resting in the cabin while others sat outside to catch any breeze. In winter they huddled together for warmth, burning wood that Marcus collected on Sundays, the one day each week when they weren't required to work for Henderson. They were together, though, and in the economy of slavery, that was a fortune so rare it felt like a gift, even though it should have been a right. Ada was 5 years younger than Marcus, born in 1834. She'd inherited Ruth's quiet grace and developed a gift for healing. Not formal medical training, which was forbidden, but knowledge passed down through generations about which plants could reduce fever, which roots could stop bleeding, which teas could ease pain. Enslaved people rarely saw the plantation doctor unless they were too valuable to lose, so Ada became their physician, treating injuries and illnesses with whatever she could forage from the woods. Thomas had arrived on the plantation in 1850, purchased from an estate sale after his previous owner died bankrupt. He was a skilled carpenter, able to build anything from coffins to cradles with minimal tools. Henderson used his skills constantly, loaning him out to neighboring plantations and taking a portion of Thomas's earnings. Thomas and Ada married in 1851. And if they resented that their marriage had no legal protection, that Henderson could separate them any time he chose, they never spoke it aloud. The 7 of them created a life within the narrow confines of bondage. They told stories to the children, teaching them about a grandmother who'd survived the Middle Passage and remembered Africa. They sang songs in the evenings, voices blending in harmonies that carried across the quarters. They shared food when someone had extra, comforted each other when grief became unbearable, celebrated small joys, a successful harvest, a beautiful sunset, a child's first steps, because joy itself was resistance. But underneath the surface, Marcus was planning, always planning. Everything changed in August of 1855. The first sign of trouble came on a Monday morning when Henderson called Thomas to the main house. Thomas went, as he had to, and returned 3 hours later looking hollowed out. He gathered Ada and Marcus in the cabin that evening and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I've been sold. Man from Mississippi. Plantation near Natchez. Leaving in 4 days." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling out in waves of grief and fury. Ada made a sound that wasn't quite human, a keen of loss that made Marcus's chest tight. Esther took Ada's hands. Ruth began to pray, words flowing in languages she'd inherited from ancestors who'd been stolen from places whose names she didn't know. Marcus said nothing. He went outside, walked to the edge of the cotton field, and stood there for hours, staring at darkness. 4 days later, Thomas left in a wagon with 3 other recently purchased enslaved people. Ada watched him go, her face expressionless, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles went white. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury they couldn't afford when anyone might be watching. That night, Marcus lay awake in the cabin listening to Ada's breathing, too controlled, too measured. He listened to Samuel's soft snoring, to Mary's small sighs. He thought about Thomas in a wagon heading south, probably chained, definitely terrified. He thought about how easily Henderson had severed a marriage that meant everything to the people involved, but nothing to the law. And he decided something had to break, either the system or him. And if he was going to break, he'd do it in a way that mattered. Henderson's finances had deteriorated throughout 1855. Poor cotton yields due to unusual weather, too much rain in spring followed by drought in summer. Gambling debts accumulated during trips to Mobile, where Henderson liked to feel important among merchant-class men who tolerated him for his money, but didn't respect him. Bad investments in a railroad venture that collapsed when the engineer absconded with investor funds. By autumn, Henderson was cash-starved and increasingly desperate. He began liquidating assets, which meant selling people. Not all at once, which might spark panic and mass escape attempts, but gradually, 1 or 2 every few weeks, breaking up families with the casual cruelty of a man selling furniture to pay rent. In September, Henderson started looking at Marcus's family with new attention. "That boy of yours is valuable," he mentioned to Marcus one morning. "Samuel, he's 4 years old? Perfect age for training. I've got a buyer in Mobile interested in young ones for housework, offering good money." Marcus was cleaning equipment in the barn when Henderson said this. He continued working, kept his face neutral, his voice even. "He's young yet, sir. Still learning. That's the point. Train them young, they're more obedient, more useful." Henderson watched Marcus carefully, looking for reaction. "Man's offering $600. That's good money for a child. Would help with my situation considerably." "Yes, sir." Marcus's hands were steady on the tools he was cleaning. Inside, something was calcifying into diamond-hard determination. "I'll be making the sale in October. Wanted to inform you, as a courtesy. I know you're fond of the boy." "Thank you, sir." Henderson left, satisfied that Marcus had accepted the situation with appropriate submission. That night, Marcus made his first escape. He didn't tell anyone, not Esther, who would have begged him to stay or insisted on coming too. Not Ruth, who would have tried to talk sense into him. Not Ada, still mourning Thomas. He simply waited until the cabin was silent with sleep, memorized the faces of his wife and children in case he never saw them again, and slipped into the darkness. He'd prepared for weeks, stolen a knife from the kitchen, saved scraps of food, cornbread, dried meat, a few hard biscuits, filled a small flask with water. Rolled these items into a piece of canvas and hidden them under the floorboards of the cabin. He left at 3 in the morning, when the night was deepest and the patrols would be least alert. Moved through the cotton fields like a shadow, staying low, moving fast. The moon was a thin crescent providing minimal light, which was exactly what he needed. Marcus had a destination in mind, though it wasn't freedom. Not yet. He was heading north toward Utah, 47 miles away, where he'd heard rumors of an underground railroad conductor operating from a mill. He didn't know if the rumors were true. Didn't know if he'd be captured immediately. but staying meant watching his son sold away, and some things break you worse than death. The first night he made 15 miles, stayed off roads, navigating by stars and the general knowledge that north was away from the river. Hid in a hollow log when he heard dogs in the distance, not search dogs yet, just regular hounds that might alert their owners to movement. At dawn he found a thick stand of kudzu vines and crawled deep into them, creating a nest where he couldn't be seen from any direction. Ate a piece of cornbread, drank water sparingly, waited for night to fall again. The isolation was profound. For the first time in his life, Marcus was completely alone. No cabin full of family, no other workers in adjacent fields. Just him and the insects and the terrible clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. He thought about Samuel, 4 years old, already so curious about everything. The boy asked constant questions. Why is the sky blue? Where do birds go at night? Why can't we leave? Marcus had answered as honestly as he could without breaking his son's spirit. But how do you explain to a 4-year-old that he's property? That his body, his future, his very existence belongs to someone who sees him as currency? He thought about Esther, who would wake to find him gone. She'd know immediately what he'd done. Would she understand? Would she hate him for leaving? Would Henderson punish her for Marcus's escape? That last thought made him sick with guilt, but he pushed it away. If his plan worked, if he could reach free territory and earn money, he could buy them out. Send for them legally. It was a desperate gamble with astronomical odds, but it was better than watching his family be sold piece by piece. On the second night, Marcus made another 20 miles. He was getting cocky, moving too fast, not checking carefully enough. At dawn, exhausted and looking for a hiding place, he chose poorly. A tobacco barn on the outskirts of a small farm. The farmer discovered him at mid-morning. Marcus woke to the sound of a shotgun being cocked. Opened his eyes to find a white man in his 50s staring down at him with an expression of weary resignation. "You running?" the farmer asked. Marcus considered lying, decided it was pointless. "Yes, sir." "From where?" "Henderson Plantation, Greene County." The farmer sighed, lowered the shotgun slightly but kept it ready. "You know there's a reward for returning runaways?" "Yes, sir. Probably $50. Maybe 100 if Henderson's feeling generous." Marcus said nothing. His hand was inches from the knife hidden in his canvas roll, but attacking this man would only make things worse. He waited. The farmer studied him for a long moment. "You got family back there? Wife, 2 children, mother, sister? And you left them?" "Owner's selling my son, 4 years old. Man in Mobile wants to buy him for housework." The farmer's expression shifted slightly. He looked away, jaw working. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I got 3 sons myself. Can't imagine." He trailed off. They stood in silence, the morning sun slanting through gaps in the barn walls. "I should turn you in," the farmer said finally. "I need the money. Crops were bad this year. Got debts." "I know, but I won't." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a flicker of hope so painful it was almost worse than despair. "Not because I'm an abolitionist," the farmer continued. "I'm not. Don't have opinions on the peculiar institution one way or another. But I got sons, and what Henderson's doing to yours, it ain't right. Even by the standards of how things work around here." He gestured toward the barn door. "You need to leave now. Head northwest. There's a creek about 2 miles that direction. Follow it north. You're close to the patrol routes here. They'll be checking barns all day." Marcus grabbed his canvas roll and stood. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm not helping you. I'm just not hurting you. There's a difference." The farmer turned away, an unspoken dismissal. "And son, whatever you're planning, it won't work. They always catch runners eventually. But I understand why you got to try." Marcus left through the back of the barn, found the creek, followed it north, made another 12 miles before night fell. On the 3rd day, the dogs found him. He heard them first, the distinctive baying of bloodhounds on a scent, still distant but getting closer. He was in relatively open terrain, pine forest without much undergrowth, and he knew he couldn't outrun them. So he tried a trick he'd heard, whispered in the quarters. He found a low-growing cedar tree, climbed into it and sat very still. The theory was that scent traveled along the ground and bloodhounds tracked by following that scent trail. If you could get above the trail, break the line, you might confuse them temporarily. It didn't work. The dogs arrived 20 minutes later, 5 of them, baying furiously at the base of his tree. Behind them came 2 patrollers on horseback, professional slave catchers who did this work for a living. "Well," one of them said, looking up at Marcus. "He's a smart one at least. Don't see many try the tree trick. Don't matter how smart they are." The other replied. "Still caught." They ordered Marcus down. When he hesitated, one of them shot into the tree above his head, bark exploding near his face. Marcus climbed down. They tied his hands and made him walk behind their horses for the entire 47 miles back to Henderson's plantation. It took 2 days. His feet bled through his shoes. His wrists went raw from the rope. They fed him once, gave him water twice, let him sleep for 3 hours each night. When they arrived at Henderson's plantation, Marcus was barely conscious. The patrollers collected their reward, $75, and left. Henderson had Marcus taken to the barn. The whipping happened at dawn, in front of the assembled enslaved workers. Henderson made it a public event because punishment was only effective if it served as deterrent. 20 lashes, administered by the overseer while Henderson watched from the porch of the main house. Marcus didn't cry out, not because he was brave, but because he'd decided during the long walk back that Henderson would get nothing more from him. No screams, no begging, no satisfaction. After the whipping, they locked him in the root cellar, an underground storage space beneath the main house, dark and damp and cramped. He stayed there for 5 days with minimal food and water, his back a mass of pain, infection setting in, despite Ada somehow getting medicine to the overseer with a lie about preventing scarring that would reduce Marcus's value. But Henderson made a critical mistake. He didn't separate Marcus from his family. He assumed the escape attempt and its brutal failure would be lesson enough, that Marcus would be broken, compliant, grateful just to be allowed back near his wife and children. Henderson didn't understand that you can't break what's already decided to break you back. When Marcus emerged from the root cellar on the 6th day, Esther barely recognized him. He'd lost weight, his eyes were sunken, and he moved like an old man. But when he looked at her, she saw something new there. Not defeat, calculation. "I'm sorry," he whispered that first night back in the cabin, holding her close. "I'm sorry I left without telling you. I know why you did it. It was stupid. I wasn't ready. Didn't plan well enough, Marcus. But I learned the route. I know where the patrols concentrate. I know which farms will help and which will turn you in. I know how far the dogs can track before losing the scent." He pulled back to look at her face. "I learned what I needed to learn." Esther felt cold despite the summer heat. "You're going to try again." "Yes. They'll kill you next time. Maybe. But Samuel's sale is in 3 weeks. I'd rather die trying to stop it than live knowing I didn't." She wanted to scream at him, to beg him to stay, to accept the unacceptable because at least they'd still be alive. But she looked at their children sleeping nearby and understood that living wasn't enough if your children had no future. "When?" she asked finally. "Soon. I have to time it right. Take me with you." "No, Marcus, if I fail alone, you and the children are still here, still together. Henderson won't sell you out of spite if I'm the only one who ran. But if we all go and fail, he'll separate everyone just to be cruel. You know he will." She did know. That was the horror of it. Marcus spent the next 3 weeks appearing to be exactly what Henderson wanted, a broken man, properly punished, learning his place. He worked without complaint, kept his eyes down, spoke only when spoken to. But at night, he planned. He'd learned from his first escape, learned that running blindly wasn't enough. Learned that he needed specific knowledge, safe houses, contacts, routes that avoided patrol patterns. Learned that desperation without information was just another form of slavery. He began to observe everything with new attention. When the overseer mentioned that patrols rotated schedules every 2 weeks, Marcus memorized the pattern. When a traveling preacher visited and spoke about his circuit through Alabama and into Tennessee, Marcus noted every town name mentioned. When Henderson had business visitors who talked about routes and roads, Marcus listened from whatever room he was working in. And he noticed something interesting. Something he'd overlooked before because it seemed too small to matter. The plantation doctor, a man named Herbert Gaines, was drinking. Not socially, not casually, but steadily, progressively, with the determined focus of a man trying to drown something. Marcus, working in the barn near where Gaines kept his buggy during plantation visits, noticed empty bottles hidden under the seat, noticed Gaines's hands trembling when he examined patients, noticed the doctor arriving earlier and leaving later, finding excuses to delay his departure. Marcus filed this information away. Didn't know if it would be useful, but information was the only currency he had. Samuel's sale was scheduled for October 15th. Henderson had already received a deposit from the buyer, a merchant in Mobile who wanted young enslaved children to train as domestic servants in his growing household. The merchant would arrive with a wagon, conduct a brief inspection to ensure Samuel was healthy, and take him away. 4-year-old Samuel, who asked questions about everything. Samuel, who loved listening to stories his grandmother Ruth told. Samuel, who had just learned to count to 20. Samuel, who didn't understand yet that he was property. Marcus made his second escape on October 12th. Parte 5. A segunda fuga é o plano impossível. This time Marcus ran with purpose. He knew the route, he knew the timing. He knew he had 3 days before Samuel's sale, which meant Henderson would focus security on preventing Samuel from being taken, not on Marcus, who'd already been caught once. He left at midnight during a rainstorm. The rain would mask his scent, make the dogs less effective, keep patrols indoors. He moved fast, staying off roads, following the route he'd memorized during his first attempt. By dawn, he was 30 miles away. He didn't hide during the day this time. Instead, he kept moving, gambling that the rain and his head start would buy him enough distance that patrols wouldn't expect him to be this far out yet. He walked openly on roads when necessary, just another enslaved person on an errand for his master. When questioned once by a passing overseer, Marcus had a story ready. He was taking a message to a plantation in the next county. His master needed it delivered urgently. The lie worked because Marcus sold it with confidence. That was the thing about slavery. It ran on assumed compliance. Most white people didn't question an enslaved person who acted like they belonged where they were. By the second night, Marcus crossed into Tennessee. He'd made it. Over 70 miles from Henderson's plantation, far enough that the normal search patterns wouldn't reach. He was still in danger. Tennessee had its own slave patrols, and any black person traveling alone would attract attention. But the immediate threat was behind him. Now came the harder part. Survival. Marcus had no money, no contacts, no real plan beyond reach-free territory. He'd heard of the Underground Railroad, the network of abolitionists and sympathizers who helped escaping enslaved people reach the North. But he didn't know how to find them, didn't know the signals, the code words, the safe houses. So he did the only thing he could think of. He found work. On the outskirts of a town called Lawrenceburg, Marcus approached a lumber mill early one morning. The mill owner, a gruff man named Patterson, looked him over with skeptical eyes. "You running?" Patterson asked bluntly. Marcus made a decision to be honest. "Yes, sir." "From where?" "Alabama, Greene County. You know I could turn you in?" "Yes, sir." "Why shouldn't I?" Marcus met his eyes. "Because you need workers, and I'm strong, and I'll work hard, and I won't cause trouble. And because you're short-handed, I can see that from how much timber you've got stacked, but not processed. And because the reward for me probably isn't worth more than what I can produce in a month of work." Patterson stared at him for a long moment, then laughed, a short, surprised bark. "You're either very smart or very stupid. Maybe both. Can you operate a saw?" "I can learn." Patterson hired him. paid him in room and board, kept him hidden from casual observers, and asked no questions. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus worked harder than he'd ever worked on Henderson's plantation, because this work was his. Every plank he cut, every timber he hauled, brought him closer to a goal he was still formulating. He slept in a small room above the mill, saved every penny Patterson occasionally gave him for exceptional work, and spent his evenings talking to other workers, free black men, immigrants, poor whites, learning about the world beyond plantations. And he learned about the Underground Railroad. Not from dramatic rescues or secret meetings, but from casual conversations. A worker mentioned a church in Nashville known for helping people. Another spoke of a Quaker family near Chattanooga who asked no questions. Slowly, Marcus pieced together the understanding that the Underground Railroad wasn't a single organization, but a loose network of individuals who shared a belief that slavery was wrong and were willing to take risks to oppose it. But Marcus also learned something else, something that would shape everything that followed. Most escape attempts failed. And when they succeeded, the escaped individual almost never managed to return for their families. It was too dangerous, the risk too high, the logistics impossible. People escaped alone and rebuilt lives in the North, forever haunted by the families they'd left behind. Marcus decided that wasn't enough. In early November, he left the lumber mill with $40 in saved wages, Patterson's grudging respect, and a letter of introduction to a contact in Chattanooga. He arrived in that growing city on a rainy Tuesday and found the address Patterson had given him, a small printing shop operated by a man named John. John was white, in his 40s, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that assessed Marcus carefully before letting him inside. "Patterson says you need papers," John said without preamble. "Yes, sir." "Freedom papers?" "Yes, sir. Cost you $20. More if you want them to look legitimate enough to pass close inspection." Marcus had $40. He needed food, supplies, and money to eventually buy his family. But without papers, he couldn't travel safely or work legally. He made the calculation. "How legitimate can you make them?" John smiled. "I'm very good at what I do." For $35, John created a complete identity for Marcus. Freedom papers stating that Marcus Robinson, a new surname, chosen at random from a list John kept, had been manumitted by his former owner in 1850. The papers included dates, locations, witness signatures, and official-looking stamps that John created using tools Marcus didn't quite understand. "These will hold up unless someone checks the actual records," John explained. "And most people won't bother. They see an official-looking document, they accept it. What if someone does check? Then you run. But you'd have to run anyway without papers, so you're no worse off." Marcus took the papers, felt their weight, both physical and metaphorical. With these documents, he legally existed as a free man. Without them, he was stolen property. "One more thing," John said. "You planning to go back for your family?" Marcus looked up, surprised. "How did you know?" "You've got that look, like you're planning something impossible." John leaned against his printing press. "I've helped dozens of people over the years. The ones who make it out rarely go back. It's too dangerous. The odds are astronomical. I know. But you're going to try anyway." "Yes." John was quiet for a moment, then went to a drawer and pulled out a folded paper. "This is a map. Shows routes we use, safe houses, contacts. I'm not supposed to give this to anyone who isn't established with the network, but..." He handed it to Marcus. "You'll need it. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. What you're planning. Most people who try it end up back in bondage or dead. The system is designed to prevent exactly what you want to do. Then I'll have to break the system." Marcus spent the winter of 1855-1856 in Chattanooga, working whatever jobs he could find that paid cash and didn't ask too many questions. He worked at a warehouse loading goods. He worked at a stable mucking stalls. He worked at a restaurant washing dishes late into the night. And he learned. He learned how the Underground Railroad actually operated. It wasn't the romantic network of secret tunnels and dramatic nighttime escapes that stories made it out to be. It was logistics. It was boring, careful, methodical work, done by ordinary people taking extraordinary risks. A conductor, someone who guided escapees along routes, might be a farmer who let people hide in his barn for a day before moving them to the next station. A station master might be a shopkeeper who provided supplies and information. Stockholders were people who donated money to fund the operation, but the whole thing ran on trust, and trust was earned slowly. Marcus became friends with a freedman named William Chen, who worked at the same warehouse. William had been born free in New York, moved to Tennessee for work, and quietly participated in Underground Railroad activities when opportunities arose. "You're thinking too big," William told him one evening when Marcus cautiously revealed his plan. "You can't just march into Alabama and take 23 people. You need resources, contacts, safe houses, transportation, forged documents for everyone, and timing so precise that one mistake ends with everyone caught or dead." "I know. So why are you planning it?" "Because they're my family. And if I don't try, who will?" William studied him, then sighed. "You're going to get yourself killed, but I'll help you anyway." Through William, Marcus met others. A Quaker woman named Elizabeth who operated a boarding house that secretly sheltered escapees. A free black doctor named James Reeves who provided medical care and falsified death certificates when necessary. A white lawyer named Robert Hayes who hated slavery and sometimes created legal documents for people who needed new identities. Each connection led to others. Each person in the network knew a few others, but not everyone, protecting the whole structure in case any individual was caught and forced to reveal information. Marcus absorbed it all, learning the codes and signals. A quilt with specific patterns hanging on a porch meant safe house. A lantern in a particular window meant danger. Certain phrases in casual conversation conveyed information about routes and timing, and he began to formulate a plan so audacious that even William thought he was insane. "You want to do what?" William asked when Marcus finally revealed the full scope. "Fake their deaths. All of them. Get death certificates, stage funerals, bury empty coffins. Then dig them up and transport them north using legitimate-looking documentation that says they're being moved for work purposes." William just stared. "That's impossible." "Why?" "Because..." William gestured helplessly. "Because you'd need to coordinate doctors, undertakers, clerks, transportation, timing, safe houses, and you'd need to do it all while operating in the heart of Alabama, where you're a fugitive. One person recognizes you, one document looks wrong, one informant talks, and the whole thing collapses. So it's not impossible, just very difficult. Marcus, my son was sold while I was gone. Did you know that?" William went quiet. "Henderson sold him 3 weeks after I escaped. 4 years old. Samuel. I don't know where he is now. Don't know if I'll ever see him again. Don't know if he even remembers me." Marcus's voice was steady, but his hands were clenched. "I can't save Samuel. Not now. But I can save the others. My wife, my mother, my sister. And everyone else Henderson will sell because he's broke and desperate. Even if you somehow pull this off, the risk, I'd rather die trying than live knowing I didn't." William was silent for a long moment. Then, "You'll need help. A lot of it. I know. And money. More than you have. I'll get it." "How?" Marcus pulled out a folded piece of paper, a letter he'd written but not yet sent. "I'm going to ask." The letter was addressed to Garrett Smith, a wealthy abolitionist in New York known for funding anti-slavery efforts. Marcus had learned about him from Elizabeth, who'd mentioned that Smith responded to direct requests from fugitives if their stories were compelling enough. Marcus's letter was simple. "Sir, I am a fugitive from Alabama who plans to return and liberate 23 enslaved people, including my family. I need $300 for supplies, documents, and transportation. I will provide detailed accounting of all expenses. If you cannot help, I understand. But I thought you should know that someone is trying, so that if I fail, someone else might learn from my mistakes and succeed." He sent the letter with no real expectation of response. 3 weeks later, he received a reply with a bank draft for $500 and a note. "I don't know if your plan will work, but I'm moved by your courage and believe the attempt itself has value. Godspeed." Marcus stared at the bank draft, his hands shaking. $500. More money than he'd ever imagined having. Enough to fund the operation, enough to make the impossible slightly less so. Now you have no excuse, William said when Marcus showed him. Now you actually have to try this insane thing. Yes. When? Soon. Henderson's finances are getting worse. He's selling people faster. If I wait too long, there won't be anyone left to save. Marcus spent February preparing. He acquired supplies, shovels, rope, canvas, medical supplies. He forged connections with people in Alabama who might help. A sympathetic clerk, a corrupt undertaker who'd falsify records for money, a freedman with a wagon who made regular trips between states for trade. And he wrote a letter to Henderson. The letter was calculated to do several things. Establish that Marcus was free and thriving, offer to purchase family members legally, and plant doubt in Henderson's mind about the certainty of property ownership. He sent it from Chattanooga with a deliberately unclear postmark, knowing Henderson would burn it, but also knowing the message would gnaw at him. 2 weeks later, Marcus learned that Esther had been sold to a plantation in Louisiana. The news arrived through the Underground Railroad network. A conductor passing through Chattanooga mentioned hearing about a transport wagon that had been raided by unknown individuals near the Alabama-Mississippi border. 7 enslaved people had escaped, including one woman from Henderson's plantation. Marcus's heart stopped when he heard the description. Woman in her early 20s, from Greene County, Alabama, recently sold to Louisiana buyer. He tracked down the conductor and got more details. The wagon had stopped at a way station overnight. The driver had locked everyone in, checked the locks personally, went to sleep. At dawn, the wagon was empty. All 7 people gone. Locks broken from the inside. No tracks, no trail, no indication of where they went. Strangest thing, the conductor said. Driver swears someone must have had tools to break those locks, but they searched everyone before loading. Can't figure how they did it. Marcus knew how they did it, because he'd arranged it. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had sent William to Alabama with specific instructions and enough money to bribe a way station operator. William had approached the operator, a man named Sykes who'd worked way station duties for 15 years and knew the routes intimately, and made a simple proposal. There's a transport coming through in October. 7 people. One of them is my cousin. I'll pay you $100 to look the other way when they escape. Sykes had negotiated up to $150, then agreed. On the specified night, he'd quietly given Esther and the 6 others the tools they needed to break their locks, pointed them toward a hidden barn 2 miles away where William was waiting with supplies and directions, and reported the escape as a mysterious break-in. The 7 people had been moved to a safe house in Tennessee within 48 hours. From there, they'd been gradually transported further north using established Underground Railroad routes. Esther arrived in Chattanooga on November 30th, exhausted and traumatized, but alive. Marcus was waiting at the boarding house when she arrived. They saw each other across the room, and Esther made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. They collided in an embrace that lasted minutes, neither willing to let go, both crying now. "You came back," she whispered. "You actually came back." "I promised." "Samuel." "I know. I couldn't stop it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." They held each other while the weight of that loss settled between them. Samuel was gone, sold to some buyer in Mobile, and they might never see him again. It was a wound that would never fully heal. But Esther was safe. That was something. That was everything. "The others," Marcus said eventually. "My mother, Ada, everyone else. They're still there. Henderson is frantic. After I disappeared, he increased security. Armed guards, more patrols. He knows you're involved somehow, but can't prove it." "Good, let him be scared." "Marcus, what's your plan?" he told her. "The whole thing. Fake deaths, forged documents, coordinated escapes, a pipeline to move people from Alabama to Tennessee to freedom." The audacity of it made Esther's breath catch. "That's impossible." "People keep saying that. Because it is. You'd need help from inside the plantation. Someone who could coordinate the timing, signal when it's safe, administer drugs to simulate death convincingly. I know, I've been thinking about that. And you'd need the plantation doctor to be either cooperative or incompetent enough to be fooled. Dr. Gaines is drinking, heavily. I noticed it before I left. Esther went very still. How heavily? Enough that his hands shake. Enough that he hides bottles in his buggy. Enough that he might not examine bodies as carefully as he should. That's not enough. You need him to actively help or be completely compromised. Then I need to find out why he's drinking. People don't destroy themselves without reason. Over the next week, Marcus investigated Dr. Gaines's background. It wasn't hard. Small-town doctors were semi-public figures, and gossip about them flowed freely. He learned that Gaines had once been a respected physician in Mobile, but his wife had died of cholera 3 years earlier. He'd blamed himself for not saving her, had turned to drink, and gradually lost his practice. He'd taken the position as plantation doctor because it was all he could get. The man was drowning in guilt and alcohol, examining enslaved people he couldn't truly help, signing death certificates for people he'd failed to save, caught in a system he didn't believe in, but lacked the courage to oppose. Marcus decided Dr. Gaines needed a reason to care. He wrote a letter to Gaines, not threatening, not manipulative, but honest. He explained who he was, that he'd escaped Henderson's plantation, that his son had been sold. He described watching Gaines work, noticing his pain, understanding it. And he made an offer. Help me save my family, and maybe you save yourself. You've been signing death certificates for people who never got real medical care, making official what the system already decided. What if, just once, you signed death certificates for people who were actually alive? What if you helped them die on paper so they could live in reality? Would that be enough to ease whatever guilt you carry? I don't know. But it's better than slowly killing yourself with a bottle. He sent the letter through an intermediary, a freed black man who worked as a courier, and agreed to deliver it personally for $20. 2 weeks later, Marcus received a reply. Just 3 words written in shaky handwriting. Tell me how. Dr. Gaines became the cornerstone of the operation. He was the one person whose authority was unquestioned when it came to determining death. If he signed a death certificate, no one doubted it. If he declared someone deceased, that person was legally dead. But he needed help because simulating death convincingly enough to fool observers while keeping the person actually alive required medical knowledge and precise timing. Dr. Reeves, the free black physician Marcus had met in Chattanooga, provided that knowledge. He sent detailed instructions about drugs that could slow heart rate and breathing to nearly undetectable levels, making someone appear dead for several hours. The dosage had to be perfect. Too little, and the deception would be obvious. Too much, and the person would actually die. Laudanum mixed with a tincture of nightshade in specific proportions. Reeves wrote in coded language that looked like a recipe for treating fever. Administered 2 hours before examination. Subject will appear deceased for approximately 6 to 8 hours, then recover naturally. Side effects include severe nausea and disorientation upon waking. Dangerous if subject has heart conditions or respiratory illness. Dr. Gaines began carrying these compounds in his medical bag, disguised as standard medications. The next component was the undertaker. Henderson contracted with a local man named Douglas for coffin construction and burial services. Douglas was not particularly sympathetic to enslaved people. He simply liked money and found the whole funeral industry profitable. Marcus approached him through an intermediary with a simple proposition. Build coffins with false bottoms. Make them look legitimate, but ensure they have airflow. Fill the bottoms with weighted material so they feel correct. You'll be paid $20 per coffin. Douglas agreed without asking questions. Money was money. The clerk at the county office who filed death certificates was harder. Her name was Margaret. She'd worked in that office for 12 years, and she took her job seriously. But she also attended a Methodist church known for quiet abolitionist sympathies, and when approached carefully by someone who attended the same church, She proved willing to ensure certain death certificates were filed without excessive scrutiny. "I won't falsify documents," she said firmly. "But if a properly signed death certificate from a licensed physician crosses my desk, I'll file it according to standard procedures. And standard procedures don't include investigating every death in detail." It was enough. The final component was transportation. Marcus found a freedman named Simon who operated a legitimate freight business, moving goods between Alabama and Tennessee. Simon was known, trusted, had permits for his routes, and his wagons were rarely searched thoroughly because he'd established a reputation for reliability. "I'll build a false bottom into one of my wagons," Simon said when Marcus explained what he needed. "Deep enough to hide people, but covered well enough that it looks like regular cargo, but I won't do it for free. This is my livelihood you're asking me to risk. I'll pay you $50 per trip. Make it $75. Deal." By February 1856, all the pieces were in place. Marcus had a network that spanned 2 states, involved almost a dozen people, and required coordination so precise that one mistake could collapse everything. "You're actually going to try this?" Esther said, watching Marcus prepare. "Yes." "When?" "Soon. I need to return to Alabama, establish myself near the plantation without being recognized, and coordinate the timing with everyone. Henderson will recognize you immediately, not if I change how I look." Marcus had grown a beard, gained weight from regular meals for the first time in his life, and started wearing the kind of clothing that free black men wore. Not quite as fine as white men's clothing, but significantly better than what enslaved people were allowed. He looked different enough that someone who'd only seen him as property might not recognize him as a free man. But it was still a massive risk. "I'm coming with you," Esther said. "No. Marcus, you need someone on the inside, someone who can talk to people in the quarters, coordinate timing, determine who's healthy enough to survive the drug, who has conditions that would make it too dangerous. It's too risky. Everything about this is risky, but it's better if we're both there. 2 people can coordinate better than 1. She was right, and Marcus knew it. In March 1856, Marcus and Esther returned to Alabama. They approached carefully, spending 2 weeks in a town 15 miles from Henderson's plantation, observing patterns and gathering information. Marcus worked as a hired laborer on various farms, his freedom papers passing inspection multiple times. Esther took domestic work at a boarding house, listening to conversations and learning what had changed since she'd left. What they learned was sobering. Henderson's financial situation had deteriorated further. He'd sold 8 more people since November, breaking up 3 additional families. The plantation was operating with minimal workforce, everyone overworked and stretched thin. Morale in the quarters was devastated. People mourning separated families, living in fear they'd be next, watching the community they'd built dissolve person by person. And Henderson was paranoid. After Esther's mysterious escape, he'd hired additional security, had dogs patrol the perimeter at night, and personally inspected locks every evening. He suspected Marcus was involved somehow, but had no proof and no way to pursue a fugitive in another state. "He's making it harder," Esther said. "Good. Means he's distracted, focused on security theater rather than thinking clearly." Marcus made contact with Dr. Gaines through a dead drop, a hollow tree 2 miles from the plantation where they left messages. Gaines reported which enslaved people were healthy enough to survive the simulated death process, and which had conditions that made it too dangerous. The list was sobering. Of the 43 enslaved people remaining on Henderson's plantation, only 23 were healthy enough to attempt this. The others were either too old, too young, or had medical conditions that made administering the death-simulating drugs potentially fatal. Marcus made the hardest decision of his life. He could only save 23. The others, including elderly people who'd lived on the plantation for decades, children too young to survive the process, people with chronic conditions, would have to be left behind. It haunted him, this calculus of rescue. Who deserved to be saved? Who was expendable? How do you choose? He couldn't. So he made the choice based purely on who could physically survive the attempt. Ruth, his mother, age 51, healthy enough, though it would be difficult. Ada, his sister, age 22, healthy. Thomas, but Thomas had been sold months ago. Ada grieved him constantly. 18 others whose names Marcus memorized like a prayer. Benjamin, Naomi, Clara, Joseph, Hannah, Peter, Rebecca, Elijah, Sarah, Catherine, Jacob, Lydia, Daniel, Rachel, Matthew, Emily, Joshua, Grace. 21 people, plus Esther made 22, plus Marcus made 23. The plan required perfect timing. Dr. Gaines would visit the plantation for routine medical inspections. During those visits, he'd privately administer the death-simulating drugs to chosen individuals at staggered intervals, 2 or 3 people per week to avoid suspicion. Each person would be examined, declared dead from various causes, and given proper death certificates. Douglas the undertaker would provide coffins built with false bottoms and air holes disguised as wood grain. The bodies would be buried in Henderson's cemetery with appropriate funeral services. Then 2 days later, long enough for Henderson's suspicions to settle, but before anyone actually suffocated in a buried coffin, Marcus would dig them up at night. The exhumed people would be taken to a hidden barn 5 miles away, property of an abandoned farm that had failed 3 years earlier. There they'd recover from the drugs, be given supplies and forged papers, and wait for Simon's wagon to transport them north in groups of 3 or 4. It was complicated, dangerous, and required everything to go exactly right. What could go wrong? Esther asked, and it wasn't rhetorical. They genuinely needed to plan for failure points. Marcus listed them. Gaines could miscalculate the drug dosage and actually kill someone. Henderson could decide to have an autopsy done on a body. Someone could wake up too early and give away the deception. I could be recognized before we finish. The authorities could raid the safe house. The wagon could be searched. Documents could fail inspection. Any of 20 different things. So how do we prevent that? We can't prevent it. We can only prepare contingencies and accept that some risk is unavoidable. They started in late March with a test case. Lydia was 43 years old, strong despite chronic pain from an injury years earlier when a cotton press had caught her arm. She'd volunteered to be first. "If this works, tell everyone it's possible," she said to Marcus during a brief meeting in the woods behind the quarters. "If it doesn't, learn from what went wrong." Dr. Gaines visited the plantation on March 18th for routine health inspections. He examined various enslaved workers, noting minor ailments and providing basic treatment. When he reached Lydia, he administered the drug mixture disguised as medicine for her arm pain. "This will help you sleep," he told her quietly. "Don't be afraid." 2 hours later, Lydia collapsed while working in the kitchen. The other workers called for help. Dr. Gaines was still on the property fortuitously and rushed to examine her. He checked for pulse. Faint enough to be undetectable without very careful examination. Checked breathing, shallow enough to appear absent. Listened to her heart with his stethoscope while announcing loudly that he heard nothing. "She's gone," he declared. "Heart failure likely. I've noted she had chest pains recently." Henderson was notified. He viewed the body with the casual disinterest of a man examining damaged property. Noted the loss in his ledger. Lydia, deceased March 18, 1856, heart failure, value lost 600, and ordered burial preparations. Douglas the undertaker arrived that evening with a coffin. He and his assistant placed Lydia inside, nailed the lid shut, and transported her to Henderson's cemetery. The burial took place the following morning, attended by several enslaved workers who sang hymns and mourned someone they believed was truly dead. Only Ada knew the truth. Marcus had told her everything, needed her help to coordinate within the quarters, trusted her absolutely. "She'll suffocate in there," Ada whispered, watching dirt pile onto the coffin. "The coffin has airflow." She'll have enough oxygen for 3 days if necessary. We dig her up tonight." That night, at 2 in the morning, Marcus and Simon arrived at the cemetery with shovels. The moon was nearly full, more risk of being seen, but necessary to see what they were doing. They worked quickly, digging down to the coffin, prying open the lid. Lydia was unconscious but breathing. They lifted her out carefully, wrapped her in blankets, filled the coffin with weighted material to maintain proper weight, and reburied it. By dawn, Lydia was in the hidden barn, beginning to wake from the drug-induced coma. She was disoriented, nauseous, frightened, but alive. Genuinely alive, not dead on paper and breathing in reality, but fully alive and free. "Did it work?" she asked when she could finally speak. "Yes," Marcus said. "You're dead. Legally, officially dead. Henderson buried you himself. And now you're going to walk away." Lydia started crying, overwhelmed by the enormity of it. 3 days later, Simon transported her north in his wagon, hidden beneath a false bottom covered with freight goods. She reached Chattanooga a week later, was moved through the Underground Railroad network, and eventually settled in Canada. The test case had worked. Now they needed to scale it. Over the next 6 weeks, 18 more people died on Henderson's plantation. Joseph, age 51, died when a tree he was cutting fell wrong and crushed his chest. Except the tree fell exactly where Marcus had calculated it would, and the crushing was simulated by Joseph lying in a specific position while Dr. Gaines declared him dead without close examination. Hannah, age 24, and William, age 8, died of scarlet fever, except they'd been given the drug mixture and showed symptoms consistent with the disease because Dr. Gaines had coached them on what to report. Peter, age 57, died of heart failure in his sleep, except he'd taken the drug mixture at night and Ada had discovered him in the morning, immediately calling Dr. Gaines, who arrived quickly to certify the death. Each death was documented meticulously. Each burial was conducted properly. Each coffin went into the ground with appropriate ceremony, and each grave was empty within 48 hours. Henderson started to notice something was wrong in April, but he couldn't articulate what. The deaths seemed legitimate. Dr. Gaines's certifications were thorough. The burials were witnessed, but something felt off, like a melody played slightly out of tune. He began investigating, visiting the cemetery more frequently, checking graves, looking for signs of disturbance. He found nothing because Marcus was meticulous, always refilling graves to exact original levels, replacing sod carefully, making the disturbed ground invisible. But Henderson's paranoia grew. He started questioning Dr. Gaines more aggressively after each death. "You're certain this one died of fever?" "Yes, Mr. Henderson. I examined her thoroughly. And the symptoms were consistent?" "Completely. High temperature, rash, respiratory distress, textbook scarlet fever. Strange how many people have died recently." "Not really. Disease spreads quickly in close quarters, and your workers have been under increased stress from being short-staffed. Stress weakens the immune system." Henderson couldn't argue with medical expertise, but he remained suspicious. In mid-April, he made a decision that terrified Marcus when he learned about it. Henderson ordered 3 graves dug up for verification. Ada managed to get word to Marcus through their signal system, a specific arrangement of laundry on a clothesline that indicated urgent message. Marcus met her in the woods at midnight. "He's going to dig up Peter, Hannah, and Joseph tomorrow morning," Ada whispered. "He wants to verify the bodies are actually there." Marcus felt cold despite the spring warmth. If Henderson dug up those graves and found them empty, the entire operation would be exposed. Every enslaved person remaining would be sold immediately or moved somewhere Marcus couldn't reach. The people already dead would be hunted as fugitives. Dr. Gaines would be arrested. Everyone involved would face consequences. "We need to stop him," Marcus said. "How?" Marcus thought rapidly, calculating options. What if the bodies were there? But they're not. They're in Canada by now. Henderson doesn't know what they looked like well enough to verify. He just wants to see bodies. Ada understood immediately. You want to put different bodies in the graves. Not bodies, just enough to pass casual examination. In coffins that have been underground for weeks in Alabama heat. It was grotesque, but it might work. Marcus and Simon spent that night raiding a pauper's cemetery 10 miles away, where bodies of indigent people were buried in unmarked graves. They took 3 corpses, all approximately the right age and build, and transported them to Henderson's plantation cemetery. Working by moonlight, they dug up Peter, Hannah, and Joseph's graves, placed the substitute bodies inside, and reburied them just hours before dawn. At 9 a.m., Henderson arrived with his overseer and 2 hired workers. They dug up the 3 graves while Henderson watched, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning for any sign of interference. The coffins were opened. Inside each was a decomposing body in approximately the right condition for the stated time of burial. The smell was overwhelming. Henderson examined them briefly, not closely because the stench was unbearable, and confirmed that yes, there were bodies in the graves. Satisfied? Dr. Gaines asked, handkerchief pressed to his nose. Henderson nodded slowly. Yes, rebury them. He left, still suspicious but unable to prove anything was wrong. Bodies were in graves. Death certificates were legitimate. Everything checked out. Marcus had gambled that Henderson wouldn't examine the bodies closely enough to notice they weren't the people whose names were on the coffins. It was a grotesque solution, but it had worked. That was too close, Esther said when Marcus told her. I know. We need to finish this soon before he decides to verify more graves or hire someone competent to investigate. They accelerated the timeline. In late April, Marcus made his boldest move yet. He sent Henderson a letter. The letter was designed to accomplish several things simultaneously. Demonstrate that Marcus had resources and organization, offer one final chance at peaceful resolution, and distract Henderson from investigating the deaths too closely. The letter read, Mr. Henderson, you are looking for 11 people who are dead. I can prove they are dead. You buried them yourself. You have death certificates signed by a licensed physician. You have witnesses who attended funerals. They are legally deceased, which means they cannot be fugitives. A dead person cannot run away. I propose an exchange. I have money now, more than you know. I will purchase my mother, my wife, my daughter, my sister, and 8 others whose names I will provide. I will pay fair market value. In return, you will provide bills of sale showing they were legally purchased by a freedman. If you refuse, I will continue my work. More people will die. More graves will be filled. And you will be unable to prove that any of them are actually missing. Because how can you search for someone who is legally dead? I await your response. Marcus Henderson received the letter on April 23rd. He read it 3 times, hands shaking with fury, then burned it in his fireplace. But the idea the letter planted wouldn't burn. Henderson began investigating in earnest. He questioned his plantation doctor aggressively. He visited the county clerk's office and examined death records in detail. He hired a private investigator to look into recent escapes in the region and see if there were patterns, and he decided to test something. He announced that 3 more people had died, elderly workers whose deaths could be explained easily. He had Dr. Gaines sign death certificates, had coffins prepared, and conducted burials, but he didn't actually put bodies in the coffins. He filled them with sandbags and buried them while secretly watching to see if anyone would try to dig them up. 2 nights later, Marcus and Simon arrived at the cemetery. They dug up the first grave, opened the coffin, and found sandbags. Marcus froze, understanding immediately what had happened. It was a trap. Henderson had figured out enough to test whether graves were being robbed, and now he had proof. We need to leave, Simon whispered. Now. They filled in the grave and ran, abandoning their shovels, disappearing into the darkness. Behind them, they heard shouting. Henderson had been watching from a hidden position, and now he knew for certain that someone was digging up graves. But he still didn't know why or who or how they'd managed to actually steal people. The next day, Henderson confronted Dr. Gaines. "Someone is robbing graves on my property," Henderson said, watching Gaines's face carefully for reaction. "What? Who would do such a thing?" "That's what I want to know, and I want to know why you've certified so many deaths recently. Disease, accidents, natural causes. I examine each person carefully and document everything. Show me your records." Dr. Gaines produced his medical journal, which contained detailed notes on every death. The notes were thorough, professional, and completely fabricated, but they looked legitimate, and Henderson wasn't a doctor. "I want a second opinion," Henderson said finally. "I'm bringing in another physician to examine your next declared death." Gaines felt cold. "That's certainly your right, and I want to perform autopsies on the next 3 deaths. Cut them open to verify the cause." "That's unusual." "I don't care. Something is wrong here, and I'm going to figure out what." Gaines managed to keep his face neutral until Henderson left, then immediately sent word to Marcus through their signal system. "Operation compromised. Henderson knows something is wrong. He wants autopsies. We need to stop or adapt." Marcus received the message and called an emergency meeting with everyone involved in the operation. They gathered in the hidden barn. Esther, Dr. Gaines, Simon, Ada, who'd snuck away using the excuse of gathering herbs, and Dr. Reeves, who'd traveled from Chattanooga when he heard about the crisis. "We have 3 choices," Marcus said. "Stop now and evacuate the people we've already saved. Continue carefully and risk getting caught. Or finish everything in one massive operation that's so audacious Henderson won't realize what happened until it's too late." "What's the third option look like?" Esther asked. Marcus outlined his plan. It was insane. It required perfect coordination, multiple simultaneous actions, and Henderson's unwitting cooperation. "That's impossible," Dr. Reeves said flatly. "So was everything else we've accomplished. This is different. You're talking about killing 12 people in one night and making it look like an epidemic or food poisoning. Henderson will never believe it. He will if we give him someone to blame besides himself." Marcus explained the full plan. By the time he finished, everyone in the barn was staring at him with a mixture of awe and horror. "You're either a genius or completely insane," Simon said. "Probably both. If this fails, we were going to fail anyway. Henderson knows something is wrong. He's investigating. We're out of time, so we either take the biggest risk now, or we abandon people who are counting on us." They voted. It was unanimous. Proceed with the final operation. On April 24, 1856, 12 people died on Henderson's plantation in a single night. The crisis began at dinner. Several enslaved workers who'd eaten from a communal pot began showing symptoms of severe illness: vomiting, fever, disorientation. Within hours, 12 people were gravely ill. Dr. Gaines was summoned urgently. He arrived to find chaos. People genuinely sick, others caring for them, Henderson frantic about losing so many workers simultaneously. "What's happening?" Henderson demanded. Dr. Gaines examined the sick people and the food they'd eaten. He found the communal pot and smelled it carefully. His face went grim. Contaminated pork, probably spoiled meat from the smokehouse. They're showing symptoms of severe food poisoning. Will they survive? Some might, but several are very far gone. I'll do what I can. What Henderson didn't know was that Dr. Gaines had arranged everything. The contaminated food had been deliberately tainted with bitter herbs that caused vomiting and fever but weren't dangerous. The 12 people who'd eaten it had been carefully selected. The remaining people Marcus needed to evacuate. Over the next 6 hours, as Henderson watched helplessly, 12 people died despite Dr. Gaines's treatment. Each death was documented. Each body was examined. Each loss was recorded in Henderson's ledger with increasing desperation. He was watching over $10,000 in human property disappear in a single night. "This is a catastrophe," Henderson said, staring at the 12 bodies laid out in the barn. "I'm sorry," Dr. Gaines said, and he sounded genuinely distraught. "I did everything I could, but the contamination was too severe, and they ate too much before showing symptoms." Henderson wanted to blame someone. He ordered an investigation into how the meat had spoiled. He questioned the worker who'd been responsible for the smokehouse. He raged about negligence and incompetence. But he couldn't argue with 12 dead bodies. Douglas the undertaker was overwhelmed. 12 coffins in one order was unprecedented. He worked through the night with his assistants, building coffins as quickly as he could while maintaining quality. Each one had a false bottom. Each one had airflow disguised as wood grain. Each one would keep its occupant alive for the crucial hours between burial and exhumation. The mass funeral took place the following day. Nearly everyone from Henderson's plantation attended, singing hymns and mourning the terrible loss. Henderson stood at the edge of the cemetery, face haggard, financial ruin staring him in the face. Among the 12 bodies being buried were Ruth, Marcus's mother, Ada, his sister, and 10 others who'd volunteered for this final massive escape attempt, knowing the risk. Esther stood among the mourners, tears streaming down her face. The tears were real, not because she believed anyone was actually dead, but because the risk was so enormous and the consequences of failure so catastrophic that grief was the only rational response. The graves were filled. The cemetery went silent. Everyone returned to their quarters, and Henderson decided he'd had enough. That evening he rode to town and hired professional investigators. He gave them a simple brief. "Something is wrong on my plantation. People are dying too frequently. My doctor's records look legitimate but feel false. I want a full investigation. Audit his paperwork, examine burial records, dig up graves if necessary. Find out what's happening." The investigators would arrive in 3 days. Marcus had 3 days to evacuate 12 people. At midnight, Marcus, Simon, Esther, and 4 hired helpers arrived at the cemetery with shovels, lanterns, and wagons. They had to dig up 12 graves in one night, extract 12 people, transport them to the hidden barn, and refill the graves so carefully that no one would notice they'd been disturbed, all before dawn, and before Henderson's hired investigators arrived to audit everything. It was impossible. They did it anyway. They split into 3 teams, each taking 4 graves. The digging was exhausting. Graves were 6 feet deep, and Alabama soil was dense and heavy. They worked with desperate speed, muscles burning, sweat soaking their clothes despite the cool night air. The first coffin came up after 40 minutes. Marcus pried it open and found Ruth inside, unconscious but breathing. He pulled her out, wrapped her in blankets, and placed her carefully in the wagon, filled the coffin with sandbags to maintain weight, reburied it. By the time they'd excavated all 12 graves, extracted 12 semi-conscious people, and refilled the graves to look undisturbed, dawn was breaking. They'd been working for 6 hours straight. Marcus looked at the cemetery in the growing light. The graves looked normal, slightly disturbed maybe, but not obviously robbed. It would have to be enough. They transported 12 people to the hidden barn. Dr. Reeves was waiting there with medical supplies, ready to help them recover from the drugs. Over the next 12 hours, all 12 people woke up, disoriented, nauseous, frightened, but alive. Ruth woke and saw Marcus's face and started crying. "You came back. You actually came back." "I promised." "But how?" "Later. Right now we need to move." "Henderson has investigators coming. We have maybe 2 days before they start checking graves and discover they're empty." Simon had 2 wagons ready. They would transport people in groups of 6, hidden beneath false bottoms, traveling north on different routes to avoid suspicion. The first wagon left that evening with Ruth, Ada, and 4 others. The second wagon would leave the following night with the remaining 6. But Henderson moved faster than expected. Parte 15th, a confrontation. The investigators arrived a day early on April 26th and immediately began their work. They audited Dr. Gaines's records, finding them thorough but suspicious in their sheer volume. 23 deaths in 2 months was extreme, even by plantation standards. They interviewed Douglas the undertaker, who nervously confirmed he'd built all the coffins to standard specifications and had no idea why so many people had died recently. They examined the cemetery and noticed something. Several graves showed signs of recent disturbance. The soil was packed differently. The grass hadn't regrown properly. Something was wrong. They ordered graves dug up. By noon, they'd exhumed 3 graves and found them empty except for sandbags, and, in one case, an unidentified body that clearly wasn't the person whose name was on the grave marker. Henderson stared at the empty coffins with an expression that cycled through disbelief, fury, and something close to awe. He actually did it. Marcus actually stole them by making them legally dead. The investigators were already planning their next moves. Alert authorities, organize searches, track down everyone involved in the conspiracy. But they needed warrants, coordination with county officials, time to organize a proper response. Time that Marcus used to run. He'd stationed Ada near town to watch for unusual activity. When she saw the investigators arrive a day early and immediately head to Henderson's plantation, she triggered the emergency signal, a specific arrangement of stones near the road that Marcus checked every hour. He saw it at 1 p.m. and knew immediately they were out of time. He rode to the hidden barn, gathered the 6 people still waiting for transport, and made a desperate decision. We're leaving now. All of us. No more staged transports. We run together or die together. Henderson will send searchers after us, Esther said. I know. But we have a head start, and we have something Henderson doesn't expect. What? We're going to use his own paranoia against him. Marcus had prepared for this possibility. He'd created a false trail. Evidence planted at the barn, suggesting the escaped people had headed southwest toward Mississippi. Forged documents showing transport arrangements to New Orleans. Fake testimony from a bribed farm worker claiming he'd seen a group heading that direction. While Henderson's searchers followed that trail, Marcus led his group northwest toward Tennessee, using back routes that Simon had mapped months earlier. They traveled by night, hid during day, avoided roads. 12 people moving through Alabama wilderness, carrying minimal supplies, hunted by professional slave catchers who would kill them rather than let them escape. On the 3rd night, they reached the Tennessee border. On the 5th night, they crossed the Tennessee River using a raft that Simon had pre-positioned. On the 7th night, exhausted and terrified and barely holding together, they reached Chattanooga. William Chen was waiting at the boarding house with food, supplies, and news. Henderson's investigators figured out the false trail. They're organizing search parties across the state. You're wanted fugitives now, all of you. Massive rewards. Professional hunters are mobilizing. Then we need to keep moving. Where? North. As far as we can get before they catch us. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus's group moved through the Underground Railroad network like water flowing downhill, always seeking the path of least resistance. Chattanooga to Nashville, Nashville to Louisville, Louisville to Cincinnati, Cincinnati to Detroit. At each stop, some people chose to settle, finding communities of free black people, establishing new lives, taking new names. By the time they reached Detroit in late May 1856, Marcus's group of 23 had scattered to 10 different cities across 5 states. But they were free, genuinely, legally free, because all of them had death certificates proving they were deceased, which meant they couldn't be claimed as fugitive property. Marcus, Esther, Ruth, Ada, and 3 others settled in Detroit. Marcus took the surname Robinson, suggesting rebirth. He found work at a dockyard, saved money, purchased a small house, and he wrote a letter to an abolitionist network asking if anyone had information about a 4-year-old boy named Samuel who'd been sold to a buyer in Mobile in October 1855. Henderson never recovered from the events of 1856. His plantation essentially collapsed, workforce depleted, finances devastated, reputation ruined. Other plantation owners whispered about him. How had he lost 23 people? How had someone orchestrated such an elaborate theft under his nose? What did it say about his management? He sold most of his remaining enslaved workers by 1857, and much of his land by 1858. The plantation that had been in his family for 2 generations was broken up and sold piecemeal to pay debts. He died in 1864 during the Civil War of what the doctor called heart failure. But what everyone knew was really despair. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his contributions to the community, but didn't mention the 23 people who'd vanished from his property like ghosts. Dr. Gaines fled to New York in July 1856 when investigators began questioning his role in the mass deaths. He settled in Brooklyn, stopped drinking, and spent the rest of his life working at a charity hospital that served poor immigrants. He never spoke publicly about what he'd done in Alabama, but colleagues noted that he seemed at peace in a way traumatized people rarely achieve. Douglas, the undertaker, was arrested and questioned, but released when investigators couldn't prove he'd knowingly participated in the conspiracy. He continued his business, but never built another coffin with a false bottom. Margaret, the county clerk, was never suspected. She continued filing death certificates according to standard procedures until she retired in 1871. Simon the wagon driver was questioned once, but his permits and documentation were so legitimate that investigators found nothing suspicious. He continued operating his freight business and quietly transporting escaping enslaved people for another 4 years, until the Civil War made such work less necessary. The abandoned farm where Marcus had hidden people was investigated thoroughly. Authorities found evidence of occupation, blankets, food supplies, signs of multiple people staying there. But by the time they searched it, everyone was long gone, and the story began to spread. Enslaved people across Alabama heard about it, whispered in quarters late at night, sung in work songs with coded lyrics, preached in religious services as parables about resurrection. The slave who escaped twice and came back for his family, the man who killed people to bring them back to life, the graves that were doors instead of endings. It became legend, and legends are more powerful than facts because you can't disprove them and you can't stop people from believing. On other plantations, when families faced separation, they would whisper, "Maybe someone will come. Maybe we can die and walk away." Sometimes inspired by Marcus's success, people tried similar escapes. Most failed. Some succeeded. The Underground Railroad began incorporating the technique into their methods, falsifying death records, staging funerals, creating legal ambiguity that made recapture more difficult. And slowly, impossibly, the system began to crack. Not because of one man or one escape or one elaborate conspiracy, but because the story of what Marcus had done proved something essential. The system wasn't invulnerable. It could be beaten. It could be tricked. It could be made to eat itself through its own bureaucratic mechanisms. Every death certificate that was questioned made the system weaker. Every grave that had to be dug up cost money and credibility. Every escaped person who had legal proof of death created a logical paradox that courts struggled to resolve. How do you return someone to slavery if they can prove they're dead? The Civil War would eventually end slavery through military force and constitutional amendment. But before that, people like Marcus were ending it one grave at a time, one forged document at a time, one impossible escape at a time. The historical record for Marcus after 1856 becomes deliberately vague. He appears in Detroit census records in 1860 as Marcus Robinson, freedman, dock worker. A church registry from 1861 shows him renewing marriage vows with Esther. Property records from 1863 show him purchasing land. Military records from the Civil War show a Marcus Robinson from Detroit enlisting in the 102nd United States Colored Infantry in 1863. He served as a scout, using his knowledge of Alabama to guide Union troops through territory he'd once fled through as a fugitive. His commanding officer noted that Robinson seemed to know every back road, every safe house, every sympathetic farm in 3 counties, knowledge that proved invaluable during campaigns. He survived the war and returned to Detroit. Census records from 1870 show him living with Esther, Ruth, Ada, and 4 children. Not 2 children, 4. 2 of those children were born after reaching freedom. But census records suggest that the other 2 were Samuel and Mary, which means Marcus somehow located his sold son and brought him north. How he accomplished this, where Samuel had been for those years, what Marcus had to do to get him back, none of this is documented. But Samuel was there. Marcus got him back somehow. Ruth died in 1872, age 67, surrounded by family. Her obituary mentioned that she'd been born enslaved but died free, and that she'd survived an incredible journey from Alabama to Michigan that sounded too remarkable to be fully true but was documented extensively. Marcus died in 1891, age 62. His obituary in the Detroit Plain Dealer, a black-owned newspaper, mentioned his Civil War service and his work with Underground Railroad networks, but it focused mostly on his role as community leader, church member, and family man. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, including dozens who'd known him in Alabama and remembered the spring of 1856 when dead people walked away from their graves. At the funeral, Marcus's granddaughter Sarah asked Esther about the stories she'd heard. Stories that seemed too impossible to be real, but too detailed to be fiction. Did Grandpa really do all those things? The escapes, the fake deaths, coming back for everyone? Esther was 71 years old by then, her hair completely white, her face marked by a lifetime of joy and trauma in equal measure. She considered the question carefully. Your grandfather learned something that powerful people never want powerless people to know, she said finally. He learned that the systems that control us are just stories we've agreed to believe. Documents, certificates, registries, they're all just papers that say a story is true. And if you can tell a better story, if you can make the papers say something different, you can change reality. For 2 years, your grandfather told a story about dead people who weren't actually dead. He made the papers say it. He made the system believe it. And because the system believed it, those people became free. So yes, he did those things. But the real miracle wasn't the escapes or the fake deaths. The real miracle was that he convinced everyone, his enemies, his friends, even sometimes himself, that impossible things were possible if you were brave enough and smart enough and desperate enough to try them. Sarah asked one more question. Do you think anyone else could do what he did? Esther smiled. I think someone is doing it right now. Somewhere, someone is looking at a system that seems unbeatable and thinking, what if I tried anyway? That's all your grandfather did. He tried anyway. And sometimes trying anyway is enough. Final. The cemetery on Henderson's former plantation was demolished in 1947 to make room for a cotton processing facility. The graves were supposed to be relocated, but many weren't. Construction workers reported finding strange things: coffins with false bottoms, graves that were shallower than they should be, sandbags and weighted material where bodies should have been. Local historians tried to investigate but found records that didn't quite make sense. 23 death certificates from early 1856, all properly filed, all apparently legitimate. But no corresponding bodies in the graves marked with those names. In 2011, a genealogy researcher named Patricia Brooks traced her family history back to Greene County, Alabama in the 1850s. She found her great-great-great-grandmother's name in Henderson's plantation records listed as property until March 1856, when a death certificate was filed claiming she died of fever. But Patricia also found her great-great-great-grandmother in census records from Detroit in 1860, alive and free and living with a family headed by someone named Marcus Robinson. She died in Alabama and lived in Michigan, Patricia told an interviewer for a local history project. Both things are documented. Both are officially true according to government records. She was simultaneously dead and alive, enslaved and free. And somehow that paradox was her salvation. The cemetery site is a warehouse now. Nothing marks where Henderson's enslaved workers were buried, where Marcus's elaborate deception played out, where 23 people were simultaneously interred and liberated. But sometimes, late at night, warehouse workers report strange things. Sounds like digging, lights that move through the building with no source, the sense of being watched by people who aren't there. Most dismiss it as imagination, the brain finding patterns in random stimuli. But older residents of Greene County, the ones whose families have lived there for generations, tell different stories. They say the cemetery wasn't just demolished, it was disturbed. And the people who were buried there or not buried there, or buried and not buried in that quantum state between bondage and freedom, are still doing their work, still digging, still escaping, still proving that death is sometimes just a door to somewhere better. They say if you're trapped, if you're desperate, if you need to die to really live, you can still call out in the darkness. And sometimes a dead man named Marcus Robinson answers. But probably that's just another story, another legend, another way people make sense of histories too complex and painful to fully comprehend. Or maybe it's true. Maybe the man who learned to die twice and live forever is still out there, still doing resurrection work, still teaching desperate people that systems can be beaten and freedom can be taken and graves can be doors if you're brave enough to open them. Maybe.